Good morning, everyone. Time for us to get started this morning. We are in Genesis 47 this morning. And we'll do just a little bit of review from Genesis 46. So remember, there's a lot of reconciliation going on. Jacob has been brought down to Egypt with the entire family. And we got basically the conclusion of Jacob's genealogy. We mentioned on Thursday that we've had this thing just kind of hanging out in Genesis for several chapters now. At the beginning of Genesis 37, we read, "These are the generations of Jacob," right, in verse 2. And we're accustomed by that point to seeing, a long list of names. And we've noted how Moses divides the book up according to these genealogies. And how that anytime you see a genealogy, that marks the shift in the story. But we get this notice in verse 2, in 37:2, "These are the generations of Jacob." And then we don't really get the generations of Jacob. We get one man, Joseph. And then we get some of the other sons, but it doesn't really focus on them. It focuses a little bit on Reuben, more so on Judah. And as we continue through, we have seen where the focus is coming down more and more on Judah. And we'll see the culmination of that once we hit chapter 49. But we've continued to see that, how Judah keeps coming to the fore. But we've not gotten an extensive list of Jacob's children and their descendants, and that finally happened here in chapter 46, now that everybody is relocating down to Egypt, now that Joseph is going to take care of them for the remaining 5 years of the famine. We get all of these names. And at the end of the chapter, and here let's start our review with chapter 46, verse 28. We'll just read through this passage again because it goes directly into chapter 47. Chapter 47 is kind of a poor chapter division here. "He had sent Judah ahead of him." All right, so you see Judah comes to the fore again. "He had sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to show the way before him in Goshen. And they came into the land of Goshen. Then Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to meet Israel his father in Goshen. He presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. Israel said to Joseph, 'Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive.' And Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, 'I will go up and tell Pharaoh, and will say to him, My brothers and my father's household, who were in the land of Canaan, have come to me. And the men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock, and they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. When Pharaoh calls you and says, What is your occupation? You shall say, Your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, in order that you may dwell in the land of Goshen. For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians.'" All right, so Joseph wants his family settled in the land of Goshen. It's going to be good pasturing ground for them. It's in Egypt where there is food, but there's still a little bit of daylight between them and Pharaoh and Pharaoh's court. So in other words, they're going to enjoy the benefits of Egypt without necessarily having to deal with some of the corruption of Egypt's city centers, where all of the power is going to be concentrated. And so Joseph has this plan. The plan is you're going to go before Pharaoh and you're going to tell him the truth. You're shepherds, and you've always been shepherds. And Joseph is going to, we're going to have these suggestions planted in Pharaoh. In fact, I think, if I remember correctly, the suggestion has already been planted that they are going to be relocated into Goshen. And what they're going to do is they're going to tell Pharaoh that they're shepherds because every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians. And so Pharaoh is going to let them settle, over there in Goshen, where they're not going to get their fleas and lice around us. And they won't be able to intermingle. Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. They've got some daylight between themselves and the Egyptians. So they are going to have room to grow without intermingling with the Egyptians. And it's going to, the way that this gets set up is going to lead us into the central conflict in Exodus chapter 1. Right? Because what do we learn about Israel in Goshen in Exodus chapter 1? What do they do in Goshen? They grow, they multiply, they fulfill. We're going to see this. We're going to continue to see this mandate brought up that we have seen so many times in Genesis. Right? We've seen it from the very first chapter, where God tells the man and the woman to be fruitful and multiply. Right? And that gets repeated all through the book. It gets repeated to Noah after the flood. Part of the promise to Abraham is that he's going to have a great many descendants. And those promises are repeated to Isaac, to Jacob. And we see a fulfillment of that occurring in Goshen. Whenever they're there and they're able to be fruitful and to multiply, and they become a great nation while they're in Goshen. All right, so that, I think, does us for review. One last thing to remind us. The last time that we saw this mention of people being abominable to the Egyptians was at the dinner, or the lunch, or whatever, the feast that Joseph hosted in Genesis 43. And remember that's an explanation for why Joseph and why the Egyptians are not sitting with the brothers, because the Hebrews are an abomination to them. So Genesis 43, verse 32, they served him by himself and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. All right, so whereas there, Joseph is holding himself aloof from his brothers, here, in the same context where he himself says every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians, we've just seen him embracing the shepherds and weeping on their necks. All right, so this reconciliation that's been going on between Joseph and his family is going along very well. All right, we see all these signs that whereas there had been division, now there is reconciliation. All right, any questions or comments before we pray and jump into chapter 47? All right, then let's bow together. Righteous Father, thank you for the great gifts that you have given us today. Thank you for the beautiful weather that you've given us. Thank you for our congregation here. And Father, I pray that we're always encouraging each other and lifting each other up to be better servants in your kingdom. Father, thank you for your word. And we pray, Father, that as we study it, we learn, Father, how to be good servants in your kingdom. Thank you for the great gifts that you've given us in your Son, for the forgiveness of sins that we have in his sacrifice, and for the hope that we have in his resurrection. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right, Genesis 47:1. So Joseph went in and told Pharaoh, "My father and my brothers, with their flocks and herds and all that they possess, have come from the land of Canaan. They are now in the land of Goshen." All right, so there we see that suggestion planted there. They're already in the land of Goshen. "And from among his brothers he took 5 men and presented them to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to his brothers, 'What is your occupation?' And they said to Pharaoh, 'Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were.'" And we're in Genesis chapter 47, just starting out. "They said to Pharaoh, 'We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen.' Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock.' Then Joseph brought in Jacob his father, and stood him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. Then Joseph settled his father and his brothers, and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. And Joseph provided for his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with food, according to the number of their dependents. Okay, let's stop there for a second. So everything goes to plan here. And by the way, this is something that's uncommon, right? They come up with a plan, and everything goes to plan. Right? A lot of times we see in Scripture, particularly in Genesis, whenever somebody's got a plan, usually there's a wrench thrown in the plan. But here it works. I think probably not least because their plan centers on honesty. Right? They're telling the truth before Pharaoh. Pharaoh asks the brothers, "What's your occupation?" And they say, "Your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were." Again, not hiding anything, the complete truth. And they make the request, right? "We have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. And now please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." Right, the language that they use here is important. We have come to sojourn. Right, in the Old Testament, what's a sojourner? Who is a sojourner? What would we call sojourners today? Visitors, possibly, but we've got some legal designations for sojourners in our land. Immigrants, foreigners, aliens. There's a long list of names that we have, but that's what we're referring to. They are coming before Pharaoh, and they're not just saying, we happen to be traveling around. They're admitting their status as foreigners. This is going to be important for the law of Moses. Right? This comes up constantly in the law. Because how does the law command Israel to look at sojourners? How are they supposed to treat sojourners? Essentially, they're supposed to receive them well. They're not quite afforded all of the status of family, but they are afforded far more rights under the law of Moses than was typical in the ancient world. So, for example, anytime that you see something that's meant for the poor or widows or orphans, you almost always also see foreigners, sojourners listed in that. So they're among the protected classes in the law of Moses. So whenever like the gleaning laws, whenever you go through your field, don't go through it twice. Don't pick up every little bit of grain. Leave something behind so that the poor, the widow, the orphan, the sojourner will have something to eat. Right now, in the law, their treatment of sojourners is always based on their own status. God is constantly reminding them, you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Right? You treat foreigners right because you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. And we see that beginning here. The brothers come before Pharaoh and confess their status. We're sojourners. We're foreigners. And they're essentially coming before Pharaoh to beg for his grace. Pharaoh doesn't owe them anything. But would you please show us favor and let us dwell in the land? And Pharaoh grants them the request. All right. So Pharaoh says to Joseph, and notice he doesn't say this directly to the brothers. He addresses this to his trusted advisor Joseph. Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brother in the best of the land. Let them settle in the land of Goshen. And if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. All right, so Pharaoh is granting them not only access to really, really good pasturing ground. Let them dwell in the best of the land, in the land of Goshen. He also tells Joseph, if you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. In other words, they are being put in the position of managing Pharaoh's own personal herds and flocks. Right, this kind of ascent should remind us of what we've already seen in the text. This looks very much like the sort of blessings that Joseph has encountered while he's been in Egypt. All right, the Lord has been with Joseph. It has shown him favor in the eyes of all of his masters, and his masters have put him in charge of things. Right? He becomes essentially the steward over the house of Potiphar. He becomes the steward over the jailhouse. And then later he becomes the steward over all the house of Pharaoh. Essentially making him steward over all Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. And now we see the same sort of description given of the brothers. If you know any able men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. All right, so this is a sign of good things to come for Israel in Egypt. All right, so that's one episode, the brothers before Pharaoh. Now we see Jacob before Pharaoh. Chapter 47, verse 7. Then Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Excuse me. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, how many are the days of the years of your life? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. All right, we should notice a couple of things first. We're going to break off right in the middle of Jacob's response here, because I want us to notice the way that Jacob is responding. There's something we should be used to seeing by now in Joseph's story. Whenever somebody is speaking to their superior, how do they always refer to themselves?
Servant.
Yeah, your servant. In fact, we see it all through the way that Joseph's brothers talk to Joseph through the entire story. They're constantly referring to themselves as your servant. All right, and remember, the word servant, in modern English, we kind of make a distinction between servant and slave. But in the ancient languages, there's no such distinction, right? Now, there were obviously different levels of servant, different levels of slave. And I think our translations generally do a good job of rendering those into English. Like whenever they're referring to themselves as your servant, they don't mean you literally own me and I am in a slave relationship to you. But we should recognize the depth to which they're humbling themselves before these men. Now, go back to verse 3. All right, Pharaoh said to the brothers, what is your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, as our fathers were. All right, they're humble before Pharaoh, and they're showing him some deference, right? They're showing him that they consider him to be their superior, because he's Pharaoh. Go down to the way Jacob responds. Now, first off, we should notice in verse 7, Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh. How are we used to seeing people, like their physical posture before their superiors in the book? Yeah, they bow down. In fact, that happens very, very often. The brothers come before Joseph and they go face to the dirt. Not Jacob before Pharaoh. He stands before Pharaoh, and then Jacob blessed Pharaoh. That catch you as significant? What does the Hebrew writer say about blessings? Do y'all remember? He talks about this with Abraham and Melchizedek. Let's jump to Hebrews chapter 7 for just a second. All right, the Hebrew writer is making this argument about how the psalmist talks about the Messiah as being according to, well, he says, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. All right, that's in Psalm 110. And the Hebrew writer's talking about that. What on earth does that mean? And he says that's an argument for the supremacy of the Messiah, the supremacy of Christ. And he draws this argument from history in Hebrews chapter 7. Verse 1, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. And then he is also King of Salem, that is, King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning nor end, neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever." All right, so he's drawing all these parallels between Melchizedek and Christ. He is King of Righteousness, King of Peace. He has neither beginning of days nor end of life. See how great a man this was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a 10th of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who receive the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these also are descended from Abraham. But this man who does not have his descent from them received tithes from Abraham, and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. All right, so he's using this argument to demonstrate the superiority of Christ's priesthood over and against the Levitical priesthood. All right, the Levitical priesthood pays tithes to Melchizedek, and Christ is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek blessed Abraham. And what's the argument about blessings? It is without dispute, beyond dispute, that the inferior is blessed by the superior. All right, so Melchizedek, the superior, is blessing Abraham, the inferior. All right, and since Christ is a priest after the order of Melchizedek, that means Christ is superior to Abraham. But let's take the logic of that. All right, the inferior is blessed by the superior. And go back to Genesis chapter 47. Verse 7, Joseph brought in Jacob his father and stood him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. That's an incredible statement. This herdsman, Jacob, from a worldly perspective, Jacob is a relative nobody. He's very wealthy, but he's a herdsman, right? We've already seen the way that the Egyptians think of shepherds. They're an abomination. They're unclean. It's like if we wanted to read a modern day parallel, Jacob is head of the dump, right? He's head garbage collector or something. And here he is standing before Pharaoh and blessing him, because the patriarch Jacob, in the scheme of things, is superior to even the Pharaoh of Egypt. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, notice, by the way, as we read what he says, notice what he does not say. "The days of the years of my sojourning are 130 years. What does he not say? Your servant. He does not bow before Pharaoh. He doesn't call himself Pharaoh's servant. He blesses Pharaoh, showing his superiority. But then notice the way that he characterizes this time. So Jacob is being magnified before our eyes in this text. But notice the way that he characterizes his life. All right, he's lived, by the way, to be 130 years old, which for an Egyptian is a marvelous thing. Right? I mean, it would be for us too, right? If any one of you came before me and said, Yeah, I'm 130 years old. Whew-wee, that's something special, isn't it? It's special also just from the perspective of the Egyptians. There is, I forget where we learn it from history. The Egyptians, as a matter of tradition, considered 110 to be kind of like the magic number, right? You are blessed with uncommonly long life if you make it to 110, right? Today, probably are. If you were to put it to people today, probably like the gold standard would be 100, right? If you hit 100 years old, you have been blessed with uncommon long life, with good age. The Egyptians thought it was 110. Jacob says, I've hit 130. All right, so just right away, that's something that's going to be shocking to Pharaoh, marvelous to Pharaoh. Then notice the way he characterizes this. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, for they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning. Right, I'm 130 years old, and I'm kind of disappointed by it, to be honest. Because my fathers lived a whole lot longer. Right? Jacob has already declared by this point that twice, that he's ready to die. Right? He says it at the end of chapter 45. He says it whenever Joseph is weeping on his neck. Now I've seen your face, and now I can die. He knows he's reaching the end of his life, and he's only hit 130. Whereas his fathers, Abraham and Isaac, lived to be considerably older. He says, few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. So he also characterizes them as evil. He's got 12 sons and a wealth of livestock, and he counts his days as evil. It's interesting. There's not really any explanation given here. And the text doesn't really interact with Jacob at all. In other words, nobody calls Jacob out on this or challenges him. There's no discussion about it. As we looked through Jacob's life, we could see where God was very clearly with him and blessing him. And we also saw confessions from Jacob, noting as much, that God's been with me and has blessed me. But why do you think he would characterize his days as evil? Do you think he's calling himself evil when he says his days are evil?
I'm thinking, he knows that in his life that he wasn't, and we made the observation many times that he wasn't quite sure whether God was his own God.
Yeah.
He called him the God of his father, but he didn't quite own him himself. So in that time, I can go back in my own life and see a lot of evil in my life. And it's more evil than good. And comparatively so, and that's probably right.
Yeah.
And in Jacob's life, I could see that.
Yeah. That's a possibility. It's a possibility. What do we commonly mean, though, whenever we say that our days have been evil? Kayvon, go ahead.
Bad things have happened.
Yeah, bad things have happened to me. And if that's what Jacob means by it, well, what could he possibly be talking about? Oh my word. Well, it's like, where would we start with Jacob? The seemingly bad things that have happened to him in his life. His brother has wanted to murder him, so he's had to run away from home. He runs away to his uncle, his kinsman, who should be taking care of him, but instead his uncle takes advantage of him, treats him as a foreigner, and keeps him essentially in captivity for 20 years, right? Just conning him out of things. He then, after he settles back in the land of Canaan, as he's settling back in, his favorite wife dies in childbirth. She's only left him 2 sons, and then what happens to one of the sons? Gets torn apart by wild beasts, as far as he knows. Yes? Yeah. So there's the word for evil, ra'ah, can mean, it can refer to unpleasantness. So we've seen at points in the text where, if you ever see the word pleasant, like in Joseph's story, that's translating the word good. It does have that range of meaning. Yeah, we could be talking, so Jacob, in other words, whenever he says, my days have been evil, we're not necessarily talking about moral evil, right? That my days have been morally bad and wrong. Unpleasant, as in bad things have happened to me, is certainly part of the range of that word. So he's been chased out by his brother, he's been taken advantage of by his uncle, his favorite wife died, the oldest son of his favorite wife got torn to shreds, allegedly. His daughter ran off with a foreigner. His sons, because they were mad at their sister running off with a foreigner, went and murdered the whole city of foreigners. It's like almost every chapter we can discover something that's gone wrong. Well, and even here recently, the famine has struck. He has sent his sons away, and they've come back not only with the grain but with the money. And so now they're probably thieves, and they've probably gotten the lords of Egypt mad at him, and not just the lords of Shechem. And now it turns out that the condition for their return to get more grain is to send the other son of his favorite wife along, the little baby, even though he's, by this point he's probably around 20 years old. He's still Jacob's baby. And he has to go down into Egypt. And, in the meantime, one of the other sons, Simeon, has been held in an Egyptian prison. Again, there's just all of these things where, when we look at Jacob's life, we see all of the blessings. And because Moses is constantly reminding us, the Lord was with Jacob in this, or the Lord was with Joseph in this. But just because we see it doesn't necessarily mean that Jacob has been seeing it. Kayvon?
I believe it was I think it was Reuben. It was either Reuben or Simeon, but didn't one of his sons have an affair with one of his
Oh, there's that too. Yeah, I'm forgetting things, aren't I? Reuben, he goes off and sleeps with Bilhah in basically a power play. So his three oldest sons have essentially betrayed him. His two youngest sons have either died or they're at risk of death. It's just, and he doesn't even know. Well, by this point, probably he does know the other son's role in selling off Joseph and making him think for these past 20 years that Joseph has been dead. All right, so Jacob's he's led a full life, hasn't he? Even being 130. All right, but that's all that he says to Pharaoh. I'm 130 years old. I've had some bad times, and I'm too young. So, in other words, my life has been awful, and it's not been long enough. It's kind of like, this food is terrible, and the portions are too small. And that's all that Jacob says before Pharaoh. And then in verse 10, again, Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. All right, so it's incredible. On his going in and his coming out, he blesses Pharaoh. Again, demonstrating beyond dispute, the inferior is blessed by the superior. All right, and then this passage ends with Joseph settling his family into Goshen. They have a possession in the land of Egypt. That is land that belongs to them. And that's going to be a temptation for them, by the way. Right, the language that's used here, that Joseph gave them a possession in the land of Egypt. Because God tells them, all right, what's their true nature while they're in Egypt? They're sojourners. That's not their home. That's not where they belong. But what are they constantly looking back toward as they're wandering in the wilderness? Egypt. We had it good in Egypt, right? We had food to eat, we had water to drink. You know, they're ignoring the part that they were enslaved and their children murdered. They're constantly looking back to Egypt.
My conclusion there is that he was lumping everything together and called his whole life, mostly, it's done a lot of bad things.
Yeah.
And all that's included. But when it says he blessed Pharaoh, you hear the word blessing and you automatically jump to the conclusion that it has to be good. You go to Genesis 48 and he's blessing his son. And things aren't all that great. So my take on that is just because it says blessing, that word, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting something good. That, we tend to think that, but it says here, so he blessed them that they say. And so this is his blessing. And the blessings weren't always that great. So when you take all that into consideration, I'm just trying to define something here. There, in the text, we aren't defined. We aren't given a definition. We just say blessing. Okay. Well, what does that mean? What does blessing mean? In other words, does it absolutely have to have always a connotation all the time?
I think we'll talk about this more when we get to chapter 49, because he's got some negative things to say about Reuben and Simeon and Levi, but it is still in the context of blessing them. All right, so in other words, he's not cursing them, and he is still giving them a blessing. Now, you're right that we're not told the content of the blessing in chapter 47 to Pharaoh. But it is still a blessing nonetheless. So in other words, at the end of 49, after all the blessings are done, even though they have been excoriated and criticized, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi still come away blessed from Jacob. They don't come away cursed by Jacob.
My take, and what you're saying fits kind of right into it. When you bless somebody, in other words, he may become, say, an archer. He's a great archer. It really becomes his ID. His identity.
Yeah.
In other words, it may not be something so great, but it becomes your identity, and you become that.
Right. Yeah. So he's not declaring Pharaoh morally good. Right. So, but he is still blessing Pharaoh. Yeah. George, I saw your hand.
It's just, a blessing, the intent of a blessing could be good. It doesn't mean it's going to necessarily turn out that way.
There's that too, right? Let's see. Okay, so good discussion. Any other questions or comments before we move on to the next section of the text? Yes?
Blessing him because he's thankful of having this opportunity of being where there is no famine.
Yeah, being able to live and not die.
He's taking care of Joseph and enabled him to bring the family and everybody there. So blessing may just be a
Yeah, and it's his role as patriarch. This is what he does. Yeah. So excellent. All right, verse 13. We've got just a little bit of time here. We'll see how far we get. I'll tell you what. Yeah, we can. I think we can finish the chapter up here, or most of it. There's not much to say about what we're about to read. Chapter 47, verse 13. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, in exchange for the grain that they bought. So remember, as we've seen this before, Joseph is not giving away grain. Joseph is selling grain. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? For our money is gone." And Joseph answered, "Give your livestock, and I will give you food in exchange for your livestock if your money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the herds, and the donkeys. He supplied them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. And when that year was ended, they came to him the following year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money is all spent. The herds of livestock are my lord's. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we with our land will be servants to Pharaoh." And here we should understand this as slaves to Pharaoh. "And give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for all the Egyptians sold their fields, because the famine was severe on them. The land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he made slaves of them, from one end of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh, and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, "Behold, I have this day bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. And at the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field, and as food for yourselves and your households, and as food for your little ones." And they said, "You have saved our lives. May it please my lord, we will be slaves to Pharaoh." So Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, and it stands to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. The land of the priests alone did not become Pharaoh's. All right, so it's almost like we're getting a montage here. Time is going by very, very quickly. Over the last many chapters, we've seen the first 2 years of the famine, and now we're getting essentially the rest of the famine. And this focuses on Joseph's shrewdness before all the people of Egypt. Because what all does he secure for Pharaoh?
All the cattle and all the land.
Everything and everybody. All Egypt now literally belongs to Pharaoh. Not only does he have rulership over it, like he already had, he owns it now. Everything belongs to Pharaoh. And the end result of all of this, the lasting consequence for Egypt, is this arrangement in verse 24. "At the harvest you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be your own." Now, are the people upset at these terms? No, they're actually pretty happy with these terms, mainly because, well, they say, "You have saved our lives." Right? They recognize the consequence of this. We should also bear in mind that in the ancient world, these kinds of grain loans were fairly common, and the interest rates on them were really, really high. Right? We complain about interest rates today. The sorts of interest rates that were set by statute in the ancient world were in the neighborhood of like a third, 33%. Right? Even some of the worst interest rates that we get today, like on credit cards and things, they don't often approach 33%. Right? We're used to seeing things like, over the last, say, decade, we've been able to get, under 5% on home loans? That's the kind of interest we're used to paying. They're used to paying, over 33%. And Joseph comes to them magnanimously and says, "Pharaoh will only take 20%. And they're happy about it. Do you think Pharaoh's probably happy about it? We don't get Pharaoh's reaction, but I can't imagine him being upset with what Joseph has done here. And notice there, by the way, if you've, let's see, I almost forgot about this. Well, we have no time for this. In verse 21, if you are reading, I think the Old King James, in verse 21, it says something to the effect of Joseph moved all of them into the cities. That's based on a textual variant, which we will have to get to on Thursday. It's not a big one. It is very, very similar. Like the words for to make someone a slave and to make someone go, to move someone, they're very, very similar. There's only one letter's difference. And the two letters, all right, so here's the Hebrew letter R, and here's the Hebrew letter D. All right, and you can see how close they are to each other. And that's the only difference between those two words in Hebrew. So if some scribe gets a little sloppy in their handwriting, you have no idea which word it is. All right, but Joseph is shrewd. His family is taken care of. And notice, by the way, who's the only exception to this entire scheme? You people selling themselves to Pharaoh. The priests. And remember who Joseph's in-laws are? He married into a priestly family. Joseph has conveniently set up an arrangement in which he and his family are exempt and still free. All right, thank you so much for your comments, your questions, and your kind attention this morning.